Great to be here with Eddy and with all of you. We were going to have a short chat about the role of the local VC versus the role of the global VC. And one of the interesting things is I'm from Crowberry Capital. We invest in seed stage startups across the Nordics, which are a market of around 27 million people. And Eddy here is a investor in a 10 times larger market, Indonesia. So maybe you wanted to tell a little bit about your fund.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, it's really a privilege to see so many of you. This is my third time to Finland last year, so really great. So yeah, as Helga mentioned earlier, we do run the only Indonesia-only fund in the world. So we exclusively back Indonesian homegrown companies founded by Indonesians. She's right that we are privileged to have a little bit, from at least on a population perspective, a 300 million population, fourth largest in the world, and a market that's headed currently today at probably 16th largest by real GDP, but allegedly fourth largest market in the world, exceeding Germany, Japan, et cetera, in the next 20 years. So our market, at least we go deep in Indonesia, and if we have the privilege thereafter, we have the luxury to then expand out of Southeast Asia. But I know the mentality, I think, which I really like here in the Nordics, is that day one mentality of going global. No different than you see, let's say, Taiwan to the world, Singapore to the world, Israel to the world. So in our case, once again, we go deep in our own market, and thereafter we spill over to other markets.
But you also bring the world to Indonesia, don't you? You were telling me earlier that you spent 6 months a year in San Francisco, and how important is that in your overall strategy, that you have this outreach to Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so I think that's super critical. I mean, me personally, I was born in San Francisco, been in the venture industry for about 30 years, made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I think the life-changing deals for me were initially meeting Peter and Elon 30 years ago and bring PayPal to Asia. Experienced out through that. So we really focus on being both hyper-local with the largest early-stage investment team in the country at 12 investment professionals in a market, I kid you not, with about 150 financings a year. So what that means is that if each of our teammates meets one company a month, we've covered the entire market. But we also blend in global, call it global knowledge. So today, we are backed by about 50 of the top funds in the world, like Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, DST, GGV, Pantera. So the top vertical focused managers as well, so that can deliver a lot of these global insights, and we pair that with hyper-local insights. In a country dominated by 50 to 100 families, or diversified conglomerates, we have about 40 of them invest in us. So we have hyper-local knowledge, as well as with the regulators, but we pair that with global knowledge. And I think that's what's really, really special about our operation, being the only firm that's both hyper-local, with also a presence in Silicon Valley, where I've been investing for, call it 30 years, whether it be the PayPals of the world, the Palantirs, SpaceXs, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we see in the Nordics. I mean, I think we are a seed fund, and I think in the Nordics we have this 27 million population, so we kind of have to think, as you said, global from the first day one. And I think all the seed funds, that there's a lot of collaboration among the seed funds in the Nordics. So for example, Crowberry, we work with Maki and Adventure and all the great, and Sisu Games and all the great Finnish funds. But I think it's common with all the local funds that you have to have a network of global funds that you bring into the companies, because they bring a different expertise in terms of geography or sector. And I think that's something that, but I also think, and I don't know how you feel about this, Eddy, is that sometimes the global funds don't see what we see as local players. We understand the ecosystem. We know who are the good players and who aren't. And I think sometimes, because I think startups are a lot about execution. You always hear about the storytelling is so important. But especially in the Nordics, where we're maybe not very good at communicating, but we work hard. So I think sometimes execution trumps storytelling. And I think sometimes global investors, if they don't go with a local partner, can be blinded by storytelling. I don't know what your
No, I mean, spot on. I think that's kind of how we position it, really being that beachhead strategy. I think at super early stage, I think for a lot of the global funds, without that local context, it's like, for example, myself, right? Like, I'm not born in Indonesia. My whole team is. My co-founder, Patrick, was the head of Goldman, and based there, studied abroad and came back. But I do think that early stage, when there's that storytelling, it's very tough for a global fund to really diligence it, right? Yeah. They don't have that local knowledge, whereas as a local firm, I mean, we make a couple phone calls. We probably know that person's mom, dad, aunt, uncle, their removed cousin, their wife, or whatever it may be. So we can diligence very quickly. And also, I think there tends to be, a lot of the global funds, because they're vertically focused, they have great understanding of China ecosystem, India ecosystem, US ecosystem, like you look at Sequoia before its bifurcation, GGV, et cetera. But I think down to, let's say, maybe they're not specialists down to the Nordic countries themselves.
Yeah.
So I think that super hyper local knowledge is mission critical. How do you work with the regulators, right? Like think back to, we have the Stripe of Indonesia, Southeast Asia, which today is the most valuable, I guess, fintech business in all Southeast Asia at about $3 billion, which is Kleiner Perkins' biggest investment ever in Indonesia, same with Axel, Tiger, Coatue, Insight. And I think early days, everyone's just like, Stripe's going to dominate and kill you, right? They have unlimited capital, they sit in Singapore. But I think us understanding and appreciating how the regulators work, and this is a firsthand learning, I think back to 30 some years ago when PayPal wanted to look at, let's say, certain Asian markets, I think that people just underappreciate how challenging the regulatory environment, despite the fact that though some of the regulators were even relatives of mine in Taiwan, we ultimately couldn't get the license. So I think that learning, if you will, 30 years later, when we looked at this business thing, hey, Stripe's just going to kill you, it completely wasn't the case. If you look 6 years into it, Stripe still had no license, and ultimately today we run a $40 billion GM, $40 billion in payment volume, whereas Stripe in our markets is probably 1% of that, if you will, is that maybe they don't really understand how to take stuff that's non-credit card. I parallel out to Uber, for example, right? So Uber very aggressively went into a lot of countries, and I feel in the countries that are big enough, if you will, the local interest groups, whether it be government, the private sector, will battle against you. And with Uber, similar. People are like, hey, they're going to kill you. You have unlimited capital. The last two general managers of Uber are both LPs in my fund, dear friends of mine. But I think when they came in the market, I think that they didn't necessarily understand how to take anything but credit card. In a market of 300 million people with a 3% credit card penetration rate, and of those 3% of people with a credit card, I hate to say it, a lot of them have private drivers, so hence Uber's, so a TAM of effectively almost zero, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that you do need both hyper-local and global, and I think it like a tennis court. A lot of the hyper-local investors, I'd position myself, Helga, et cetera, playing at the net, right? And then you have the regional investors where, I don't know how you say it, it's not the right thing to say, but maybe in Europe, they're neither here nor there. They're not local enough, nor global. Then you got these global brands from Silicon Valley, from New York, or even London, and they come in. They don't necessarily purport to understand local, so I think we need to position ourselves hyper-local so we can support both the regional and the global investor.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I think I like the tennis analogy, because I think, and I think, are there any cases, like if I think about what we've done, I think one of my first investments as a VC was a company that actually made a medical device, because you were talking about regulation, out of fish skin, and because I was from Iceland, I kind of understood this. And it just became a unicorn last year, which was really nice. But I remember in the early days, you would go and talk to like the global investors and say, we have a medical device out of fish skin. It's like, we hate medical devices, and who can make a medical device out of fish skin? But sort of being a local investor and understanding sort of the sector, and it was a really good investment for us. Are there any stories that you guys have that you as a local investor see things that a global investor wouldn't?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that Internet 1.0, you look at any ecosystem, let's think back to China, for example. You had Amazon in the US, then you had, let's say, call it, Alibaba in China, you had Expedia in the US, then you had Ctrip in China. If you run local parallels in Indonesia, you'd have Traveloka, which ultimately was invested by Expedia in the OTA sector. You had Tokopedia. So Internet 1.0, I think you're going to see more copycat businesses. As the internet gets established, you're going to have call it online marketplace, online travel, et cetera. But that's the next step, is that you go call it the picks and shovel businesses. And that's when you start getting that appreciation, if you will, for deltas, whether it be regulatory, right? If you need payments, you need to work with the regulators. And then you get to Internet, call it 3.0, where we start having, similar to yourself, we have companies like in shrimp farming in my portfolio, right? That's a very uniquely Indonesia business, where shrimping is probably Indonesia's second biggest in the world, where we're releasing, shrimp feed. If you release too much, the pond gets too dirty, and but if too little, then the shrimp don't inadequately big. We also have a Sharia compliant challenger bank, right? That is not a business that the global investor would appreciate. We are also looking at a seaweed opportunity right now. So I do think some of these uniquely, in your case, Icelandic businesses or uniquely Indonesian business, the global investor for the most part, and they don't purport to understand it.
No.
But I do, once getting back to it, I think the storytelling matters so much early stage, but once you get to call it Series B, C, it's a scoreboard at that point. And so I love backing these narrative violation-like businesses that like global investors would underappreciate. Or sometimes, early ecosystems are heavily backed by people that grew up in market, studied at amazing programs like Harvard, like yourself, where I spent a lot of time. But I love backing these, call it local-born founders that maybe don't speak the best English, but ultimately, maybe they're unbackable by global investors on day one, day two. But once they hit $10 million in ARR, then you just point at the scoreboard and it's irrelevant.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. And I think that's the local investor can see that. I'm also thinking, because we have an audience full of investors and founders, are there any opportunities in Indonesia for Finnish founders that want to export to Indonesia, or Finnish investors that want to invest in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting market. I mean, big user base. That's truth be told, you look at the Supercells of the world, where their founders have been. We've been privileged to have them as investors in our firm. Many different gaming companies have partnered with us. The Garenas of the world, the Twitches, the Supercells, the Craftons, PUBGs, etc. But I think one thing, on the outset, we go, hey, 300 million people, it's 10x the scale of Nordics from a population base. But I really think that even Indonesia itself, that's very misleading. The actual TAM, I'd argue, maybe it's 300 million, right? There's 4 Indonesias. You have Indonesia 1, which is, call it 5 million people at $135,000 GDP. That's more akin to New York or San Francisco. Those are people that probably can order, go buy LVMH. That's their target market, right? An LV bag. You have Indonesia 2, which is about 70 million people, $7,000 GDP per capita. So that's more akin to like a Thailand. I think those are accessible, obviously for gaming. If it's micropayment, if it's more selling on ads, then I get a little bit nervous. To this date, Google and Facebook, their third biggest market in the world is Indonesia. That said, if you look at their revenue from call ads, it's quite minimal, pales in comparison, because once again, the GDP per capita as a whole is 5,000. Now, first 5 million people is 135,000 GDP. Second, 70 million is 7,000. The third set of 100 million people is more like 3,000, 4,000. These people probably are watching their first movie, having their first Starbucks. And then you have the last 100 million people, which, truth be told, is kind of what we envision the next 20 years will come out of this rising middle class. And these folks, unfortunately, still are sub $1,000, but we are seeing, maybe their GDP per growth a little bit faster. So I would say for those type of consumer businesses with an interest in entering the market, I think user base is very interesting, but you have to take a very long-term view, and also you need your business model monetization strategy. You need to think very, very carefully about that. Who are you targeting? Is it Indonesia 1, Indonesia 2, 3, 4, and you're seeing very similar dynamics that you would otherwise see, let's say in China, if you will, in the early 2000s. I covered that market from day one, where to this day, I would argue that the majority of the Chinese population still is in the countryside. So it's really tier 1, tier 2 city. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So, and I quite like the opportunity for gaming, because I mean, I know there are a lot of great gaming founders in the Nordics as a whole.
The gaming, I mean, if you look, ultimately, I mean, the reason we have all these, whether it be gaming funds or gaming founders invest in us, is they have an interest in the market, in the region, and huge user base, but I think you just need to be very patient and smart about what is your strategy. Is it, an ad-based strategy versus a micropayment-based strategy? And I think the Indonesian consumer historically, they don't, necessarily go to Costco or whatever it may be, or Carrefour and buy, the big, toothpaste or the big mouthwash. They're very much more like sachet-based, where it's like one little strip it all, like a coffee. Yeah.
No.
And I think the micropayment concept, similar to in China, I think goes a lot further than more of a subscription-based model.
Oh, okay. Interesting, though, because we're one of our Finnish gaming companies is about to launch a mainframe, and they're launching PAX Day. You heard it here first this month, so it's been highly anticipated in the Finnish ecosystem. But I know that they're also targeting Asia and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the Indonesian market. If you look, you think back to Zynga. I mean, I would be hundreds of millions of users. Zynga, all these major players have had big user base, but when they dive deep, one of the challenges still is ARPU, and that is improving, but it's still a work in progress.
So if they go for the 135,000
I would
tier
say
1.
the tier 1, tier 2, I think that, there's legs, but if you're very patient with it, then, over time.
Cool. Anything that surprises you about the Nordics, or are there any similarities that you see between Indonesia and the Nordics?
Well, what I've found is I think the folks that I've spent time with in the last year, I look at our investor base, people are just, very intensely, entrepreneurial, and I think in Indonesia, similarly, for good or bad, I don't want my founders to have too many side gigs, but they have, definitely, people are pretty entrepreneurial in nature. I do think that one thing we need to get better about is, a global view. That said, given I think that we have a unique, home court advantage that we can go deep first, because I would argue that we're not getting those synergies. Most people talk about Southeast Asia as a region, you guys may have here, and I think we're the first firm to come out globally and say that that's really a fallacy. I would say that I'd argue it's 10 different languages, family, power structure, and regulatory, whether it be Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines, et cetera. So you need 8 separate legal teams, 8 separate go-to-market teams, 8 separate government and regulatory teams. There's not a concept, for example, here, maybe more of a European Union to some extent for border patrol. A very simple example, and it's not. I personally don't fly private, but I know my understanding in Europe is that if you fly private, it's somewhat affordable. In Southeast Asia, given that it's each different country, the aircraft control towers, it's cost prohibitive.
Oh, right.
And so getting back to it, I think that the mentality here, I think, is amazing that day one you go global. And I experienced that personally, being born in San Francisco, but growing up each of US Silicon Valley, my parents from Taiwan, which is a 24 million person population, which I'm very proud to say is today is the highest GDP per capita in all of Asia at about 40,000.
Wow.
And on day one, the mentality, at least in the call it the hardware business, whether it be in semiconductor and components, is that your sales is all to the United States. And I think back to the founders I met from Rovio, from Skype, from Supercell, et cetera. That day, global mentality on day one, I think is incredible. And that's one thing I think that the Indonesian ecosystem we need to work on.
No, and I think that's one of the things I love about investing in the Nordics, because each home market is too small, and even the Nordic market as a whole is too small, so we have to think global from day one. Also, just thinking about all the things that we can learn from Asia. I was traveling in Asia last month. I went to Vietnam, and then my husband pointed out to me, you don't see anybody not working, and you can really feel that it's a dynamic economy. And I think here in the Nordics, we're very, very hardworking, but we have this kind of, we probably don't work around the clock as you would in Indonesia, so maybe I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, I go back and forth on that, but yeah, I guess, I would argue when we talk about Asia, to call it a monolith, you have emerging Asia, which I'd argue is Vietnam, for example, right? 100 million people, growing at 5% plus GDP. You have Indonesia, call it 300 million people, 5% plus GDP. But then, of course, you have developed Asia, which is the Taiwans, the Koreas, the Japans, et cetera. And I think in emerging Asia, a lot more of a kind of pyramid where you have this, what we call demographic dividend, where you have a lot of young people, and less old people, so you don't need support. Whereas in developed Asia, one of the challenges, and I think similar to the Nordics, I'm not as familiar, is that the birth rate is quite low.
Yeah.
And in light of that, due to cost, et cetera, and so in light of that, it's more like this, and I think it's a little bit, one thing that we got going for us in emerging Asia for the next 20 years is this demographic dividend, in large part up to 2050, no different than what you see in Africa.
Yeah.
And I think that the work ethic, getting back to it, I think that there's less of a divide between what's a work day and the Chinese, the 996 or whatever it may be.
No, good point. Do you notice, I must say, I've been in venture since 2009, and I think 2009 was probably a really good year to invest.
Yeah.
But people didn't know it then. And you've been in venture much longer. And I think even when I started in 2009, people were sort of saying, if you're not in Silicon Valley, you're not in the game. And it's been really nice to see how the world has changed. Now it feels like good ideas can come from everywhere. They can come from any Nordic country, and they can come from Tampere in Finland, or they can come from Reykjavik, or anywhere in Indonesia. So that's been kind of nice to see that change. So during that change, do you think that the role of the local investor has increased and improved, or?
Absolutely. I think that I've had the privilege to do investments, a lot of failed ones that you might not hear about. But I guess since the late 90s, and I think back to even in the 90s, San Francisco wasn't even a thing. It was like Silicon Valley, literally Silicon Valley, down in San Jose, right?
Yeah.
San Jose, Fremont, Milpitas, where Cisco Systems was, et cetera. And you slowly started seeing that even change just in the Bay Area, where probably in the early 2000s, even PayPal wasn't, it was down in Palo Alto, right? But I would say starting in 03, 04, 05, you started seeing that fold where Airbnbs, the Ubers would start, opening up in San Francisco. And then you started even more, right, where the New York ecosystem opened. Yeah. Then you had Austin, and then obviously Boston for biotech, or whatever it may be, San Diego, whatever. And slowly it's getting more and more global, and we really have to think those local champions. And I think back to, let's say, Taiwan's ecosystem. It was heavily influenced by guys like Morris Chang, right, that grew up in market like my folks, studied at MIT, at Harvard, at Stanford, then was at TI, and then maybe saw a bamboo ceiling in the United States and took his learnings back to Taiwan at the age of 55 in 1984 in my hometown to build TSMC to a semiconductor monopoly. It's it's a $1 trillion business almost today, right? And I think 83 to 90, Taiwan, they had nothing to point to before Morris had a chance to be in the US and learn, right? If you look at China 2000 to 2007, similarly, when I started, no one thought about China.
No.
Even in 2002, 2003, Sequoia China opened in 2005 with a client of mine, Neil Shen, right? But once again, Neil Shen had the privilege of study at Yale, right?
Yeah.
So early ecosystems is very tough to get off the ground because you have nothing to point to, nothing that eats, lives, looks like me, right? And if I think about Indonesia, when we started the firm in 2015, there's only 3 companies in value chain over 100 million. Today there's 100, right?
Yeah.
90% of those founders, I put out a thesis 8 years ago, so you can timestamp it in Forbes magazine, 8-page spread, that I was going to go on every major campus, like Harvard, where you went, and spend time and meet every Indonesian on campus. The reason it's achievable, I kid you not, is that in Stanford there's only been 10 Indonesians in 10 years, 1 per year. But the point being is, if you look 8 years later, 90% of those founders study in the United States.
Wow.
So that hyper-local piece, but then the next generation of founders starts ecosystem. Getting back to it, until you see a unicorn in market like your fish business in Iceland, people are non-believers. They're like, how could that be me? But once you have a couple of people to look to, those are those role models, and the ecosystem opens up, and then global investors then can get comfortable investing. So the world is very different than it was in the 1990s. Silicon Valley was the only place you could invest. China was non-existent then.
No, I mean, and I think we feel this a lot in the Nordics, and everybody sort of says, and especially because we're headquartered in Iceland, and you say I'm in venture and I am headquartered in Iceland, and then people say, oh, that's such a tiny population. But I do like to point out to people it's 6 times the size of Palo Alto. So so it's not about how large the local ecosystem is; it's how strong the local.
Look at Estonia, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Like with all these guys. Look at the number. The unicorn per capita is insane.
Yeah, they're amazing, and you have some amazing sort of investors there, like Tavit and Sten and Karma and stuff like that, and they've really and that was all due to Skype, and I think and also here in Finland, you've had some amazing unicorns like Supercell and things like that have really given people confidence to invest in.
And once you put it on the map, these folks often in their later stages of financing took on capital from global capital. Once they proved that, then the first question is like, show me one good company from there, and then I'll start believing it. Once you have a couple of these Supercell, I think back to when Sean Parker and them went to do Spotify, right? They came out and did Spotify, and all of a sudden people are like, Spotify. And the next thing is that then the global investors have some familiarity and something to point to, and then their investment committees in New York or San Francisco can get comfortable deploying into Iceland, Finland, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a really, really good point. Also, just wondering about sort of gender equality. We were discussing this backstage because I think one of the things that we have in the Nordics that we're very proud of, I think we're a very sort of inclusive culture, and maybe it's easy to be because we are kind of small countries, but we also have a very high degree, especially Finland, or Iceland, Norway, and Finland rank the top 3 in terms of gender equality. And I say that we've invested in some amazing female founders here in Finland. What is the gender equality like in Indonesia?
Yeah, so I would say at least at our firm, people see, I remember when we first started out and Fund 1, Fund 2, and I think our first 3 associates were all women, and people are like, hey, Eddie, you satisfy the, whatever convention, of, gender equality. I'm like, no, it's like we hire who's the best, and by chance, everyone's treated the same, whether it be male, female, whatever the flavor it is. So, and if you look at our founders, similarly, it's really, really exciting. Last month, I guess in April, or 2 months ago, I said, in Singapore, we had this, what do they call it, Founders Forum Asia. They're having it in London next week, I know. And if you looked on the panel we had focused on Indonesia, it was myself and 2 of my founders, both were women, 2 of which one runs the most valuable fintech in all Southeast Asia at $3 billion, right? So I do think that there's an appreciation, and by no means is it like a gender lens investing. We just by chance choose the best founders, and a lot of these women are just incredibly resilient.
Yeah, I think by statistically, 50% of the best founders should be women.
They should be.
Yeah, so we're like half the world. So that
pain tolerance. I haven't given birth to a child, but if anyone, I look at my wife and other people,
is there anything that you can? I think one of the things about having a local investor, and this is what my portfolio companies tell us, is that then if you have a local investor on the board, when things get tough or that you need somebody that understands the local market, it's really, really important and nice to have a local investor on the board. Is that sort of the same?
By all means. I think back to our ecosystem in Southeast Asia. It was dominated, if you say 12 years ago, by Singapore-backed funds. There's 5 funds backed by the Singapore government that would sit in Singapore today, fly Indonesia, tomorrow Philippines, et cetera. And that was the name of the game because the local managers, truth be told, have no money, right? Like I think in 2015, an aggregate $150 million was raised in all of Indonesia. Last year was $1 billion, last year was a horrible year, right? And so I think that even during the pandemic, this was most pronounced. Even though yet you could be in Singapore just an hour or two flight, it's still meaningless versus you're in San Francisco. And so at 11, 12 o'clock at night, who's at your office, right? And I think getting back to it, that local investor is when they have an issue with the regulators, when you have an issue with local conglomerate ABCFG is maybe on an accounts receivable side, we're that one for you, and like we're that local partner to you if you are, let's say, Pantera Capital sitting in Silicon Valley, biggest crypto fund in the world, or a Lightspeed, or a Head of Sophia, or a DST sitting out here. So getting back to it, I think that you need to play tennis at the net, but you also need a partner at the baseline. And I think that when you partner with a firm like ourselves, or partner with like your firm, where you also have both your hyper-local and global, then I think an entrepreneur gets the best of both worlds, right? They got somebody playing at the net that understands the local ground game. I mean, in the Vietnam War, for good or bad, it's clear the Vietnamese probably won. They had inferior technology to the Americans, and they had way less money, right? But it's just they understood, how to battle on the ground. And I think back to most companies, I think gaming aside, because maybe it's just over the internet, Google, Twitter, and Instagram, if there's ground game, like in Uber's context, naturally, Uber ultimately didn't beat these guys, but in many cases they had to merge with, let's say, Didi or whatever. But once there's on-the-ground combat, I think you need that local investors. Otherwise, you're dead on arrival. You're halfway across the world, different time zone, no concept. It's like backing my firm without my co-founder. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't back me for an Indonesia strategy.
No, and I think one of the success stories here in Finland is Volt, which somehow sort of took on Uber Eats and everybody, and then they managed to build, and then they, from what I understand, had a better last mile delivery system, understood how European cities work and things like that. So,
I mean, also it is in itself. Like, I mean, if you look at these moats, I mean, being let's say a Finnish or let's say a Nordic company, once you build, you go out into these, you're a beautiful, what do you call it, like, buy versus build strategy.
Yeah.
Think of one of my key partners, founded a company called Karim, right, in the Middle East, right? They ultimately sold to Uber for $3 billion, the same concept. Is Uber going to go build, or are they going to, buy? And I think that, the companies here, well, I had the privilege to spend time with one of the founders, I guess, in January this year.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Yes. Fantastic. So you know all the best Finnish founders, it sounds like.
No, so far so.
Any kind of pitfalls that you see as a local VC that you could do? And I mean, given that you sort of have the global and local mentality, is there anything, any mistakes for local investors to avoid or anything?
Yeah, I would just say for ourselves, one thing I've been, sometimes struggling a little bit, and I think day in, day out about this, is that you got to really avoid these, if you will, kind of false positives early on. So we have this process. We do a lot of B2B companies. We meet you if the chemistry's good, spend more time with you. Then we take you to conglomerate ABCDFG, right? And Indonesia, for good or bad, is a country dominated by 50 to 100 diversified conglomerates, about 40 of which are invested in our fund. But one thing I've noticed is that in markets like Indonesia or in Asia, let's say Korea and Taiwan, I think enterprise is interesting. And then you have, but then you have this just huge drop off. And it's not like America where you have hundreds of these kind of regional banks that they're probably as big as an enterprise in Indonesia. Like they're 10 to $50 billion businesses. So that next level is sometimes missing. So out the gate, let's say we can get to 1 million to 5 million ARR. Where I get a little bit nervous is once we get past that to 10 million. Do we still have that growth where in America, you have this concept, back day in SaaS, whatever, 332 or whatever, million, then 3 million ARR, then 9 million, then 18. Where I find on the front end, and in part, it's because we have maybe an unfair advantage in getting things out the gate. But sometimes, once we get there, how do we continue maintaining that level of growth without going, call it regional? I think in consumer, that's achievable. Once you can do, let's say, 5 million, 70 million users, then we have to go out. But in enterprise, that's one thing I need to get more comfortable with, is that we don't have as deep of a bench in terms of enterprise clients as you would see in a developed market like the United States.
I think one of the things that I know people worry about in Europe is that, I think the seed stage in the Nordics and in Europe is well catered for, and I think founders have a lot of choice, which is good. I think one of the things that people struggle with now is that there aren't, and especially it's become very evident in the market the way it is there isn't enough growth funding. And people worry that, once companies start taking off, and then they kind of get a US investor and they're not European or Nordic anymore. And I know this is something that's been discussed a lot in the ecosystem. Is that something that people worry about in Indonesia, or how do you deal with like the growth cases and the stuff that's really stellar?
No, that's a great question. So when we started the firm, in 2015, there was an aggregate, once again, aggregate $150 million deployed into the Indonesian ecosystem as a whole. Obviously, not for the right or wrong reasons. In 2021, 2020, it was like 30, 40, it got up to 5 billion, which maybe was too much, right? So I would argue when we started, the ecosystem had no follow-on financing. Like, I would invest at seed. Our first fund was 20 million, the last one was 144, and I had no idea who'd do the A, B, C, or D. That's why I had to bring on about 35 of the top funds from Silicon Valley to invest in me, such that, hey, look, Eddy, you're somewhat a known quantity. I've known you for 10, 20 years. If you're showing me something, it must be pretty good. And so that's how we solved for it. So I do think that good businesses will always get funded. There were many businesses that were a little bit more questionable, I think in the 2020, 21, 22 timeframe that were getting funded that maybe, were negative gross margin businesses. So I'm not too nervous if a business can actually hit the scale, but it does call into question your comment earlier, getting back to my false narrative thing where on the outset it gets like this, is that does the business have enough legs to be a multi-billion-dollar business that makes it even interesting for some of these global investors? These global investors nowadays, I mean, the top managers, benchmark discipline, keeps it, but other firms are running like, let's say $1 billion, but that means they need a $5 billion exit. With a straight face, I'm not confident how many $5 billion opportunities there, unless we go Indonesia of the world like you guys do.
Yeah, okay, no. Any final words? We have 1 second.
No, this is, it's really been a privilege. To the extent anyone has questions, I'll be around the next couple of days. Do grab me. And thanks again, Helga.
Okay, thank you so much. It's fantastic having this conversation with you. Thank you.